Tell us how you really feel. Follow us on social media at onWURD. This is WURD Radio, 96.1 FM WURD and 900 AM WURD, Philadelphia. Black Talk Media. The views and opinions expressed by the guests, listeners, and hosts of any program on WURD Radio do not necessarily reflect those of ownership, management, or advertisers of this station.
This is the Radio Courtroom with Attorney Michael X. It's a revolutionary program with a revolutionary attorney. Welcome to the revolution. And while the revolution will not be televised, it is on the radio. We call this radioactive radio. In other words, it's not just radio talk, it's also radioactivism. And it's not just radio conversation, it's also radio confrontation. And yes, we call it the radio courtroom because we deal primarily with courtroom related stuff like criminal law and civil law, like family law and administrative law, like estates law and real estate law, like tax law and parking law, like any type of law you can imagine, but it's not exclusively law related. We also deal with cultural stuff and political stuff and historical stuff and current events. But again, it's primarily law related stuff. Why? Because this is yours truly, Attorney Michael Cord, aka Attorney Michael X, aka the angriest black man in America. So we focus primarily on law-related stuff. In fact, today, like last week, it'll be almost exclusively, not exclusively, but almost exclusively, because we got some great lawyers. And we had such a great conversation last week about alleged police reform that we had to do and have to do part two today. I'll talk more about that in just a couple seconds, because in about 3 minutes, we'll have our first guest among several guests who will be talking specifically about police reform, what it is, what it's not, and what it should be. Those of you who want to join in the conversation, you're welcome to do so. The numbers are 215-634-8065. Once again, 215-634-8065. Toll free, 866-361-0900. Once again, 866-361-0900. 900. And by the way, you can check us out all the time, anytime, from everywhere at WURDradio.com. Once again, WURDradio.com. And speaking of you having access to us anytime, everywhere, all the time, this show, as all the shows on WURD, streaming on WURD Facebook Live, streaming at YouTube, and streaming at Twitch. So you can catch us anytime, all the time. There's WURDradio.com. There's WURD 96.1 FM. There's WURD 900 AM. There's WURD Facebook. There's WURD YouTube. And there's WURD Twitch. As I said, you can check us out anytime, all the time, everywhere. And we have such important topics today that I really am excited about not only the topics, but the guest we're going to have, because last week's discussion was informative, and not just informative, it was enlightening, because a lot of times when you hear about police reform, it stems from tragedy, like it has this time. I mean, we can talk about so many black folks who've been brutalized by the police department. And out of that, hopefully something comes good. And I say hopefully because, and I mean no disrespect, correction. I mean the ultimate disrespect to most attorneys. And I'm not saying all. I'm certainly not saying all. I'm just saying most. Well, maybe I should say many. Yeah, let me change it from most to many. Far too many attorneys are only about the money. You know, we call people who sell their bodies sexually, we call them prostitutes. Well, what do you call people who sell their brains legally? You call them prostitutes as well. To me, anytime you sell something just to make money, you're a prostitute. Whether you're an intellectual prostitute or a sexual prostitute or whatever. In other words, you devalue or denigrate something of quality, your body, your brain, in exchange for something like money. I mean, again, you sell your body only for money, then you're a prostitute. You sell your brain only for money, then you're a prostitute. And far too many attorneys are prostitutes. Before we get to our guest, and we'll get to our first guest in 30 seconds, you know, many of these lawyers are what I call vultures, because what they do is they circle around in the sky. And just like vultures will circle around the sky and look down into the ground and see if there's an animal dying or dead, and then swoop down on the carcass. Well, many lawyers do that. They wait for black folks to get killed by cops, and then they swoop in on a wrongful death lawsuit to get their 40% cut. They wait for black folks to get beaten down by cops, and then they file their police brutality complaints, and they get a 40% cut. And then they leave town. You never see them doing stuff to change anything. In fact, they profit from the death of black people. They profit on the brutalization of black folks. But every now and then, you get some attorneys like Kevin Mincy, and attorneys like Marnie Jo Snyder, and attorneys like Paul Hetznecker, and attorneys like Riley Ross, and attorneys like Stephen Stewart, who they do what they're supposed to do for their client. They file lawsuits to get compensation. They file lawsuits and maybe they'll get punitive damages, but that's not their reason for litigating. Their reason for litigating is to change things, because you can file a wrongful death lawsuit today and get your 40% cut of a $5 million settlement, and then somebody gets killed tomorrow, and somebody gets killed next week and next month and next year. And all you do is come in and get your 40% cut, but you never try to change things. Well, that's what Kevin Mincy is trying to do. That's what Marnie Jo Snyder is trying to do. That's what Paul Hetznecker is trying to do. That's what Riley Ross is trying to do. That's what Stephen Stewart is trying to do. And we're going to jump right into it right now with the first of those great attorneys, my good friend. You've heard him a number of times on the radio, and you've seen him on TV, Kevin Mincy. Kevin, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Michael. Happy New Year. Thanks for having me on.
Very same to you and your family, and thank you for being on. And before we jump into it, and I want you to talk about anything you want to talk about, but if you could, kind of focus on this whole body cam thing and tie that to transparency. But let me start out by saying, in terms of full disclosure, I'm part of a team of great attorneys, and I've mentioned their names, and we filed a massive lawsuit against the city and police officers for police brutality. And the thing, I don't do civil law, generally speaking. I'm a criminal defense attorney, but when I found out that Kevin Mincy and Marnie Jo Snyder and Paul Hetznecker and Riley Ross and Stephen Stewart were coming together to file a lawsuit to make changes, I said, well, where do I sign up? And so I'm proud to be a member of that team. And I wanted each of them, and some of them were on last week, some will be on this week, to talk about a recent report that was issued that deals with police brutality. I'm going to turn it over to Kevin. Kevin, first, if you could just spend about 30 seconds telling us a little bit about yourself, because I want people to know that the guests I have on know what they're doing. So I want you to brag for about 30 seconds about your background, and then I want you to talk about this report that was recently issued, and then I want to hear from you in regard to some reforms, in particular in regard to body cams, transparency connected with that, or anything else. But first, a little bit about yourself, and what is this report that was issued about a week or so ago?
Sure. Thanks, Mike.
And did we lose Kevin?
No, I'm here.
And we might have lost Kevin. I'm hearing an echo in the background, so we might have lost Kevin. And if we did, we're going to try to get him back. I can hear an echo in my headphone, but the show will go on. Let me just do this as we try to get Kevin Mincy back. And he's going to go into more detail than I'm about to, but let me just tell you about this report. Back on, I believe it was Wednesday, December 23, a report was issued, and it was entitled "The Philadelphia Police Department's Response to Demonstrations and Civil Unrest." And as you all know, there was major civil unrest from about May 30 until June 15. And folks were just fighting mad, and should have. I'm getting some information from my producer letting me know that we are having some technological problems, but I understand we do have Kevin Mincy on the line. As soon as we clear up the technology, we will get back to Kevin Mincy. So please, folks, be patient. We're going to hear him, and we're going to hear everybody else. Apparently, some folks, I guess the listening audience, can hear him, and initially I could hear him, but then I began to hear some echoes in the background. But we have a top-notch producer in the studio, and he just sent me a text saying he believes we have everything lined up. It wasn't Kevin's fault. It wasn't anybody's fault. It's just technology. Kevin Mincy, can you hear us?
I hear you, brother.
Thank you very much, and thanks for your patience. You know how technology works. Sometimes it flows, sometimes it doesn't, but it's not going to stop what we're trying to do. Kevin, first I want you to do what I asked about before we had to get things situated in the studio. One, spend about 30 seconds talking about / bragging about your impressive background. Tell us a little bit about this report that was issued, I believe, back on December 23, and then offer some proposed solutions to the issue of police brutality and police reform here in Philadelphia. I'm going to turn the microphone over to you.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Mike. My name's Kevin Mincy. I'm a partner in Mincy Fitzpatrick Ross. We do civil rights cases along with criminal defense and some other matters as well, but really have turned ourselves into a civil rights firm. I'm a former prosecutor in Philadelphia, and I'm a double HBCU grad. I graduated from University of Maryland Eastern Shore and Howard University School of Law, and that's when I came here. So I've been in tune and being taught about the issues affecting black folks, obviously all my life, and certainly since my professional career started as well. This report that they released on December the 23rd, a couple days right before Christmas, which, and my spider senses went up immediately, thinking that they don't want people to read this. This is why they put it out when they did. It's basically...
Now, Kevin, before you go on, you said they. Who's they? Is it the police department? Is it the police commissioner? Is it the mayor? Who released this report?
Well, this is a consulting agency and a law firm hired by the city of Philadelphia to review the actions taken by the police officers during the civil unrest that you were talking about while we were clearing up the technical difficulties. And so they have, interviewed a number of people, looked at, I guess, a number of body-worn camera videos that they have access to, and then obviously looked at the news coverage and news videos that were released to come to their conclusions about some of the actions that were taken by police in West Philadelphia and in Center City regarding how they policed protesters and black and brown folks.
Very well said. First of all, thank you for the background regarding your bio. Very impressive, and the concise summary of that report. Now, let's just talk about what happens now. I mean, I know you've been doing a lot of civil litigation regarding police brutality, and I certainly wanted you to talk about the body cam issue and all that. But before you do that, Kevin, what basically is the report saying? Is it denying police brutality? Is it saying that we're working on it? Are they offering some recommendations? And once you answer that, Kevin, then talk to us about the whole body cam issue.
It's interesting because it's saying a little bit of all of that. It's saying that there were some instances where police may have gotten a little bit out of control, but the police were confronting or facing very serious issues and angry protesters, and people were throwing things at them, so they were trying to kind of justify the actions of some of the police officers.
Okay.
And they're trying to pacify folks by letting you know, hey, look, we're already working on some initiatives and some changes and reforms, almost as a way to try and tamp down the cry for massive police overall and police review.
Okay. So, again, I want you to focus on, if you can, the whole issue of body cam. First of all, let folks know, what does that mean? Does that mean that the cops are videotaping everything all the time? Explain what that's all about.
Now, that would be ideal if as soon as they came on duty, they had these cameras on their chest and just recorded everything that was said and happened. But that's not what happens here. And so right now, about a little bit less than half of Philadelphia police officers are equipped with body-worn cameras. And they're primarily focused in, right now, I think, the 24th, 25th district, and they're starting to spread out among the rest of the city. And so these are cameras that are worn on their chest that police officers can activate when they are about to encounter somebody, make an arrest, if there's some type of some type of incident happening, as the police officer remembers to turn it on, then it will capture from the police officer's view what happened. And there are a lot of problems with that. Obviously, one, you know, the officers have the option to turn the camera on and off. And so that's a big problem for us. You know, not all the officers have these cameras. And it's interesting because the police are essentially doing the bare minimum here as far as when it's initiatives that can protect us and give us full transparency as far as the conduct of police officers, right? They'll spare no expense on the tanks and you know, the machinery to fire the tear gas in the neighborhoods and that type of stuff. But when it comes to the cameras, they're baby stepping it into existence. And one of the reasons why, I think, is really the example that you saw. I don't know if you saw that video that was going around from that officer in Boston who was basically bragging about intentionally hitting a Black Lives Matter protester over the summer because one of his brother officers had their camera on and was just recording what was being said. And there's a lot of liability issues out there for the police if they were to allow that to happen, which is why you have a lot of issues with officers simply, quote unquote, forgetting to turn it on, turning it on after they've already taken people into custody, and not getting the full picture and full story of what happens on the streets, you know, during these different police interactions.
And, you know, I'm glad you mentioned that because, like I said, a lot of people think that if you're talking about body cam, then, you know, hey, this is a great thing. Everything that cop sees, the public will see. But you broke it down to make it clear that that's not the case. Before you talk any more about that, Kevin, talk a little bit about the case that you and your firm is handling. I understand that the police attacked your client and dragged the baby out of the vehicle and then flipped it around to use it as an image of great police work. Talk a little bit about that.
Right. Well, that was the National Fraternal Order of Police that did that. I wish I could blame Philadelphia, but it would be disingenuous of me to say that they did this in particularly, at least as far as I know right now. But yes, we represent a young lady, Rakia Young, who was driving home after or during, I guess, the Wallace protest right after Mr. Wallace was killed in late October. Officers swarmed her car as she was driving down Chestnut Street, smashed out all her windows, dragged her and her baby and her nephew out of the car, separated her from her child by putting her in a paddy wagon, putting her in zip ties and handcuffs, taking her to the roundhouse, ultimately not charging her and releasing her, but she suffered physical injuries, emotional injuries. And while all of that was happening, somebody snapped a picture of a police officer holding Miss Young's child. And that picture found its way to the National Fraternal Order of Police's website or Facebook page, and they created this narrative that the police officer was saving this child who was wandering barefoot in the city in a sea of lawlessness and violence, and the only thing that was protecting this child was the officer. And then they made statements, you know, we are the thin blue line, you know, we are the only thing standing in between, you know, you and anarchy, et cetera. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but essentially promoting kind of like a Trump extreme right-wing political narrative. And they co-opted the image of Miss Young's son and painted her in a real negative and false light in doing so in order to do it. And so while we're pursuing the matter against the city police officers for what they did to Miss Young physically, we're also pursuing the matter with the National Fraternal Order of Police for what we believe is defamation and casting in a false light, invasion of privacy for what they did to her and her son.
We're talking to Kevin Mincy, attorney extraordinaire, who's talking to us about the report recently issued here in Philadelphia. We're going to take a quick commercial break. When we come back, I'm going to ask Kevin, is there any body cam video of that incident he just talked about with his client and the baby? And also, as we wrap things up with attorney Kevin Mincy, I'm going to ask him, what's the solution? You talked about the problems of body cam. If you were a police commissioner, what would you do? What could you do to make changes? First, a break. WURD 96.1 FM.
Solutions on Word. Hosted by Dwayne Royster and Amadi Braxton. Solutions on Word. Exploring solutions to national, state, and local issues through the lens of race and gender. Solutions on Word. Fridays 5 p.m. till 7 p.m. exclusively on WURD Radio, 96.1 FM and 900 AM WURD. Solutions is sponsored by Power Interfaith Movement, working towards life, liberty, and democracy for all. As a business owner, hiring and developing people from the community that your company serves is one of the best ways to show commitment to that community. Let WURD Radio help with Livelihood, our new initiative that connects Philadelphians with companies like yours. We'll feature your business, open employment opportunities, and resources to connect your company with talent and ensure that you reach your target demographic. To learn more about how Livelihood can help you build your team, visit wordworks.com. That's WURDworks.com. Livelihood is supported by the Nightland Fest's Local News Transformation Fund, Borealis Philanthropies Racial Equity and Journalism Fund, and the Solutions Journalism Network.
You're listening to the Radio Courtroom with attorney Michael Cord, exclusively on WURD Radio, 96.1 FM and 900 AM WURD. Black Talk Media.
Yep, like the man said, Black Talk Media. We have on the line our first guest of the day, attorney Kevin Mincy, and he's talking to us about police quote-unquote reform, and he's focusing on body cam. I'm going to ask him a couple questions. One, Kevin, the incident you talked about with your client and the baby, was that on any police body cam, if you can disclose it? And the second thing is, you've posed, or I should say presented, the problems in regard to body cam here in Philadelphia. If you could change things, what would that change be? Go ahead, Kevin.
So I would say I would be shocked if there was not at least one body camera image of what happened to Miss Young. We just have not been able to see it yet. It hasn't been made available to us. But I'm positive, just because of the amount of police officers that were out there, there has to be some type of body camera footage out there to explain what the officers did and why they did it. Now, as far as solutions go, Mike, I think there's a couple of things. One, the Philadelphia police needs to enforce their own body camera policy. So there have been studies conducted over the last few years since they started rolling out body cameras about how many times officers are turning on their cameras, when they're turning them on, et cetera. And what we found is that there are a number of incidents where you're getting the camera turned on after the person has been arrested, so you're missing all of the quote unquote criminal conduct that the officer is going to make the allegation about. And then when you find that they're violating the policy, there's no punishment. Very similar to the police position on these face masks and COVID-19 protocols, where you have them blatantly violating these rules that are designed to protect citizens. And the penalty is there is no penalty. And what happens when there's no penalty? It's like if you're raising a child and you catch them stealing cookies and you don't do anything about it, guess what they're going to do tomorrow? They're going to go back and get more cookies. That's what the police officers are doing here. They know that there's no punishment for it, and so they turn the camera on and off as they see fit, essentially manipulating the evidence in the video that can be available either to be used against them or to protect the safety of citizens. I think the second issue, Mike, is they need to store the videos for longer. I think right now, Philadelphia does the bare minimum of storing videos just for 60 days. And a lot of times when you're talking about body camera footage, these people are sometimes taken into custody. Maybe they're given high bails, even if they haven't done anything, especially in cases of when someone's been assaulted by police and they're ultimately charged with assaulting a police officer. So it takes a long time for you to work yourself through the criminal justice system and, win your innocence and win your freedom. And then by the time you're able to be released, they're saying, oh, well, we only kept that video for 60 days. And meanwhile, that person was focusing on their freedom and not necessarily their civil rights case. And so they should at least, at a minimum, meet what SEPTA does, which is SEPTA holds their videos for at least a year. And what they really should probably do is hold it for at least 2 years, since we know that almost all personal injury claims and civil rights claims have 2-year statutes of limitations. Obviously, that would be to the benefit of citizens and to litigants like us, and that's probably a reason why they don't do it. But I think those two solutions, and I know that means that means money, right? Obviously, we'd have to pay for additional storage to be able to hold this video for a period of time. But they have been, like I said earlier, they've been spending money on tanks and Army equipment for years, and so let's take some of that money that we're spending on all of those things and redirect it in a way that we can have, more effective and more transparent policing with the storage of body camera footage.
Kevin, here at the Radio Courtroom Show, we always talk about what Malcolm said, which is to make it plain. So anytime we have these fancy big-time lawyers like you on, I'm hoping that they don't use that highfalutin legal jargon, but simply make it plain. And I got to tell you, Kevin, you've done an excellent job in doing that, laying out the problems and offering some practical solutions. Kevin, in our final 15 seconds, if folks want to reach you, if they want to reach your firm, what's the phone number, what's the email, what's the website, social media? How do folks get a hold of you and your firm?
The phone number is 215-587-0006. The website is www.minceyfitzross, MINCEY, S as in Frank, ITZROSS as in Sam.com. And you can find us at 1500 Market Street on the East Tower in the Center Square building. All our emails are usually our first name and then minceyfitzross.com. So mine's Kevin@minceyfitzross.com. And we look forward to hearing from you guys. If you have any issues that are happening in the city, please feel free to reach out to us.
I got to tell you, Kevin, I really appreciate that. We have you and several other attorneys from your team on today, but you are an excellent lead-off batter. I mean, you did a great job laying things out so clearly, so perfectly. We appreciate that, but it's not over. We still have other folks coming up. We got Marnie Joe Snyder. We got Paul Hetznecker. We got Riley Ross. Last week we had Stephen Stewart. So I appreciate you. I appreciate the team, and I mean it when I say that you are not just an attorney, but you're a student of Charles Hamilton Houston, who said that a lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite on society. You are a social engineer, Kevin Mincey. Thank you very much, man. Have a great day.
Thanks, Mike. Talk to you soon.
All right. And as I said, we started off 1 for 1, and we're not finished. But before we go to our next attorney, as you know, every Sunday at about 11:30, we have the great Dr. Molefi Asante, the godfather of Afrocentricity, with something we call Asante's African Announcements. Dr. Asante, how are you today, and Happy New Year?
Well, I'm very, very happy, and I'm very delighted to be on your show today, because you have a very powerful show. And whenever anybody's talking about Charles Houston, I always know that they know precisely our history. And most people who don't know about the great Charles Hamilton Houston will not understand anything in the civil rights era, because he was, of course, the godfather of that whole era, including the work of Thurgood Marshall. So I'm really delighted.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm really delighted to be here. I just want to announce that the MKA Institute will be having a Zoom lecture on January the 17th at 4 p.m. And it's going to be open and free to the public. And in the next couple of weeks, we will be giving you more information. But the ID number, for those of you who want to get an early start, much like those people down in Georgia who got an early start.
Yes.
I'm going to give you the Zoom ID number, and it is 898-103-18598. And I'll repeat that. That's on January the 17th at 4 o'clock, the Molefi Asante Institute lecture. I'm going to be lecturing on the African-American journey of liberation and Afrocentric interpretation. And that's 898-103-18598. That's the Zoom ID. When you go to Google and get Zoom, and it asks you what you want to do, you want to join a meeting, you give them that ID number. And thank you so much, Michael. Really appreciate being able to do this. It's free and open to the public. All right.
Dr. Molefi Asante, thank you very much for sharing that. I will repeat it before the show ends, and we appreciate you spending time with us every Sunday at about 11:30, but more important, that you continue to do what you did in person at the Molefi Asante Institute. Instead of us being there physically, we're there intellectually, we're there spiritually, thanks to you and Zoom. Dr. Molefi Asante, thank you very much.
All right. That's understood.
All right. And folks, we are continuing. And, you know, it's amazing how the flow just continues, because I actually had Dr. Asante on to talk about what he normally talks about with the Molefi Asante Institute, but he tied in my comment about Charles Hamilton Houston. Then he added the name Thurgood Marshall. So we're here talking about this important legal stuff from everybody. When I say everybody, that certainly includes our second lawyer guest of the day. That's none other than Marnie Jo Snyder. Marnie was on last week, and she was talking, of course, about this recently issued report. She was talking about something called Act 111, and I wanted to have her on today to talk more about Act 111 and what we're calling reform impediments. So without further ado, I want to introduce to some of you and reintroduce to others Marnie Jo Snyder. Marnie, how are you today?
I'm good, Michael. Happy New Year. Thank you for having me.
And Happy New Year to you, and thank you for being with us. Marnie, I want you to do what you did last week, where you spent about 30 seconds just telling us what you've done in your career, a little bit about your bio. As I said about Kevin, I'm really impressed with all the great work you all do, and I want you to brag about what you've done so that people will know that the comments you make today are based on you being an excellent and experienced litigator. So go ahead, Marnie, start out with a brief bio before we get into the substance of our discussion.
Sure, Michael, thank you. So my career actually started at the Public Defender's Office in Philadelphia. And after 6 years or so, I tried my hand at big law, and I hated it. And I opened my own law firm and went back to doing what I love, which is criminal law and special education and election law. And then right after I opened my firm, the Occupy movement really hit its height, and a group of people who were protesting within a Wells Fargo were arrested. And I took on that case pro bono with a large group of attorneys. You'll hear from Paul Hesnecker. Michael, you were part of that case. And I really fell in love with representing protesters and caring about their First Amendment rights very, very deeply. And that kind of took me off the protesting scene. I couldn't go to protests anymore. I was on call. And so now I've been getting involved in more civil rights cases. And along with my co-counsel that you're hearing with today, we have these amazing discussions about police reform and discussions with our clients.
Yes.
And then I also am very, very blessed to speak to people at the Public Defender's Office like Paula Said and Mike Mellon and Brad Bridge, who have been doing this work for a long time and really delve deep into police corruption and police reform. And so, you know, many of my comments come from our important discussions.
Very well said, but more important, very well done. I have to tell you, every time I hear about your bio, I'm impressed with all the stuff, the Occupy stuff, the protest stuff. But for me, the biggest deal is you leaving a big firm. Nobody leaves a big firm. Everybody fights and kills to get into a big firm, and you turned your back on a big firm. If that's not commitment to social change, nothing is. I'm really impressed with that. Marnie, let's pick up on our discussion from last week. We talked about, in connection with police reform, we talked about Act 111. Just fill in this week's audience. What is Act 111? And then we're going to talk about some reform impediments. But first, what is Act 111?
Sure. So Act 111 is it's a state law. You have to remember that it comes from the state legislature. So it's not something that each city has control over necessarily, but what it does is it has a clause that allows for binding arbitration for both interests, meaning like the police are actually negotiating what their employment contract looks like, and then also binding arbitration for grievance and discipline procedures. And that collective bargaining agreement that comes from Act 111, right? So the FOP bargains for their contract with the city, comes a whole bunch of things that I believe are impediments to reform.
And I'm so glad you broke that down. But before you go on, Mark, I just want to ask you about, because in researching Act 111, this is me talking, not you. It almost, it seems to me, in reading the exact language, it literally gives the police a license to kill. In other words, an attempt, if any other employee at any other company did a fraction of what some of the police officers have done, have been accused of doing, they would have been not only fired from the job, they would have actually been arrested. Can you talk a little bit about that, like what it does to pretty much allow cops to get away with anything?
Right. So what you're talking about is that employment agreement and the way that we deal with discipline, or the lack
Yes.
of dealing with discipline in the police department that comes from it. And some of the things that I think that the audience should know about that ends up in those collective bargaining agreements I think are detrimental are things like purge clauses. So, for
Yes.
instance, the department removes all records of disciplinary proceedings and write-ups after a period of time, sometimes as short as 2 years. So if, think about how long you might have stayed at a job, right? I was at the Defenders Association for 6 years. If I were to screw up huge within 2 years, 5 times, I might be fired, okay?
Mm-hmm.
But if I spread out my screw-ups, no matter how severe they aren't building on one another. So it's as though it's almost like my boss's minds are wiped clean, and they start looking at my performance in just what has happened in the last 2 years. And it doesn't really show how an officer has conducted themselves on the street over a long period of time. It gives them a new lease, but that's not what most people have at their job. It also allows the police to choose the hearing officers, along with the city, but sometimes those hearing officers there's not a lot of transparency in the choosing as of right now, but who are the people that are doing the arbitration, who are handing out the discipline or deciding whether or not the discipline that the police department gave is going to stand. And then there's a lack of appeal also. So the arbitration is binding and can't go to a court except for under a very limited amount of circumstances. And those circumstances, again, are so limited, they're hardly worth talking about. And so functionally, there's no appeal of the disciplinary procedure.
We have on the line today, right now, Marnie Jo Snyder, who's talking to us about Act 111. That's Legislative Act 111 of 1968. And as she pointed out, it's state legislation, so it's not a whole lot locally city council and the mayor can do. But when we come back from this commercial break, we're going to talk about possible solutions to that. What can we do? But before that, we're going to talk about reform impediments. But before any of that, we have to take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. WURD 96.1 FM.
Parents, teachers, guardians. 100 Black Men of Philadelphia introduces your 6th through 12th grade students to the world of finance. Come to the Young CEO Financial Empowerment Open House on January 9th, 2021. Sponsored by Wells Fargo. Discover 3 free programs where students may win monetary gifts, prizes, and scholarships. Register today at 2021youngceo.eventbrite.com or call 267-258-2900.
Happy holidays, WURD family. I'm Sarah Lomax-Reese, President and CEO of WURD. I think everyone will agree that 2020 has been a year to remember. Between COVID-19, the protests against systemic racism, and the presidential election, we have a lot to reflect upon this holiday season. And in the spirit of Sankofa, we have to look back to look forward. That's what we're doing in our new podcast, onWURD 2020 in Black. You can listen now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. We hope you'll check it out. As I reflect on this tumultuous year, I see the unique role that WURD, one of the only remaining Black-owned talk radio stations in the nation, has played. Through our hosts and our programming, we have been committed to speaking truth to power every day, all day, in service to our people. As we close out this year, we hope that you will be inspired to continue to support our work by becoming a 4WURD member. Visit wordradio.com/join now for details about our special holiday discount. Your support is what allows us to experiment with new projects like our onWURD podcast. We are grateful to this community for supporting our work through this extremely difficult year. We wish you a safe and healthy holiday, a happy Kwanzaa, and a new year filled with peace, power, and possibility.
It's a revolutionary program with a revolutionary lawyer. Welcome to the revolution. As the man just said, welcome to the revolution. This is the radio courtroom hosted by yours truly, attorney Michael X. Those of you who have tuned in, we appreciate it. We also ask that you reach out to family, friends, and associates and let them know that they can check us out today and every day at WURD 96.1 FM at WURD 900 AM. They can also check us out streaming, WURD Facebook Live, streaming, WURD YouTube, and streaming WURD Twitch. And they can check us out anytime and all the time on our website. That's at WURDradio.com. Before the commercial break, we were speaking with Marnie Jo Snyder, attorney extraordinaire, and we're talking about Act 111, and we're going to continue to talk about that. We still have Marnie Jo Snyder. I know in my research regarding Legislative Act 111 of 1968, I was shocked. I do mean shocked to find out what it does. There was a report, an analysis that was done about, maybe almost 20 years ago in 2002 by the Philadelphia Bar Association. And in reading that, I was shocked to find out, for example, that the Legislative Act allows the American Arbitration Association to, quote, ignore findings of fact founded by Internal Affairs and the Police Board of Inquiry. It also allows the American Arbitration Association to, quote, reject the punishments assessed by Internal Affairs and PBI, even if the facts as charged have been proven. That's why I phrased it. It wasn't Marnie who said it, it was me. That's why I said it seemed that it gives them a license to kill when you look at things like that. But let's turn it back over to Marnie Jo Snyder. Marnie, I want you to talk a little bit about what I said earlier, that this is a state law and there's not a whole lot that the local authority, city council, can do, but there's something city council has done and something city council is doing. Tell us a little bit about that.
Right. Well, before we go there, I should mention that there are state representatives who are interested in this reform. And so I should say State Rep Donna Bullock did draft legislation is drafting legislation. She wants to add transparency to the process and maybe even get rid of arbitration panels. So people do need to act in the legislature, and there are people that care about this. We just need to support them and their legislation. City Council is doing some really interesting and important things. And for one, Catherine Gilmore Richardson it passed a bill that there will be public comment on the police contract, and some of that public comment, I believe, has happened. I can't remember if it's closed or if there's another session. But that is a really important thing, this transparency, because a lot of the people who have the power to make changes to Act 111 in the state legislature and to make changes and encourage police reform need to be empowered by their constituents. Because if you think about it, this is a political issue. No one wants to say, I want to change this to the police and then make this change to the contract and then have a police officer killed and have the FOP blame it on, well, we didn't have enough money for this tank that was going to protect this officer. We didn't have enough money for this. And so, it's a political risk to put these reforms forth. And I think that things are changing. We need to support the people that are changing it. And then, of course, City Council also gets, they hold the purse strings. So they look at the budget, and they need to decide, are they going to fund the new Civilian Police Oversight Commission? Are they going to really fund it? Are they going to give it enough funding to make it meaningful and give it enough power to make it meaningful? So I think we need to watch out for that. Also, there are some important ways that City Council is putting forth reform, even where it's not associated with collective bargaining. Isaiah Thomas is putting forth a motor vehicle reform bill to try to end racial profiling stops and make sure that there are not pretextual stops and then searches of cars, mostly for Black people, which is what's going on now. And there is research to support that I know that the Defender Association has talked a lot about, that they started compiling some data. But the searches are just out of control. And Councilman Thomas has noted that and put forth this reform. So we need to support that, too.
Very well said. And again, those who just tuned in, you're listening to Marnie Jo Snyder. Marnie is part of a team of attorneys who, in connection with about nearly 250, I believe the exact number is 237 plaintiffs who've been victimized by police brutality. It's not just Marnie. Along with Marnie on that team is Kevin Mincy, is Paul Hetznecker, Riley Ross, Stephen Stewart, and yours truly. And I'm a part of that group because they are all social engineers. Of course, they're doing what lawyers have to do, seek compensatory damages and, if appropriate, punitive damages, but they're also focused on reform. That's the key thing, because you can get money today for one client and then another person is brutalized or beaten tomorrow or next week or next month. Thanks to lawyers like Marnie and Kevin and Paul and Riley and Stephen, there are reforms underway. Marnie, talk a little about, and I know you do civil litigation and you do criminal defense work. What role, if any, do the courts play in any potential reform?
So there is something called, well, there's a couple different ways, but there's something called qualified immunity. And what that means is that when you are suing for police brutality, that officer is not liable in a personal way. Right? It's not coming out of his pocket. And I think that it's kind of like what you just said about how the arbitration panels can ignore what internal affairs has done. It renders that kind of useless. It's like a joke to the police officers, whatever internal affairs comes up with, because it's just going to be fixed later in their eyes. It's kind of qualified immunity, I think, gives that similar attitude. You know, it says that this isn't coming out of your pocket. Nothing is going to change for you when you walk out of this courtroom or when you get off the stand. And your life will go on exactly as it is, and the city will pay out, and they'll pay out and pay out and pay out. And that's one thing that I wanted to point out to you also, is that the city pays these settlements, and there's not a lot of transparency about them, and there's not a lot of data collection and data release about how much has an officer cost the taxpayers, how many times have they had to settle based on this officer's actions, and what's going on here. Also, the courts nationally, I mean, this is all over the place, it's the standard which they use to decide whether a police officer's use of force was justified. And so we look at, you know, was that a reasonable police officer? How was that police officer acting at the time? Justified under the law, justified use of force under the law means that the officer was reasonable under the circumstances as they appeared at the time of the confrontation. So that means that the force is reasonable, even if it turns out they're mistaken. So, I thought that cell phone was a gun, so I pumped some bullets into that black man. The fact finder is allowed to look at, well, what did they think at the time? How scared was that officer? And what happens is the culture says, that officer can be terrified of a cell phone coming out of that black man's pocket. Because as a culture, it's constantly talking about officers need to be safe, officers need to be safe, officers need to be safe, which they do. We all deserve to be safe. But when you look statistically at when an officer is in danger of death or serious bodily injury, how frequently that happens, I think that what we do is we place officer safety above black lives and above other people's lives so often that the fact finder is constantly giving officers the benefit of the doubt as to whether they were scared in those circumstances. So it's something else that goes through that court process, and it's a standard that we think of when we go to court in these cases.
Very well said, and I really appreciate how you broke it down. We're running out of time, Marnie, so at this point what I'd like you to do is before we go into our closing argument, as it was, so you can present your final summation to the WRD listening audience, talk a little bit about police culture. What does that mean, and what role does that play in this reform issue?
Right. Well, I think Riley's going to talk a little bit about police culture as well, but I was thinking about police culture to speak with you about today, just in regards to how it's an impediment to reform. And there are some things that happen, like police departments often blame rogue cops. You hear them say a few bad apples. But that is not really a way to make organizational change, right? Taking responsibility, being accountable as a department, saying this is our problem and we're going to work through the ranks to change it when an officer does something wrong or offensive, that's really the way to make true reform. And so, you know, the few bad apples just doesn't work here, and it's really a way of shirking responsibility. There's also a police culture of hero worship that promotes the idea that a certain amount of brutality is necessary for the job. If you're a good officer, if you shoot a bad guy, right? And even better if you kill that bad guy. There's that kind of mentality that goes through police departments, and the police are trained with that us versus them mentality in mind. And it's not, a lot of officers will say that's not true, but we're talking about an undercurrent of these ideas. And I think Riley will talk about that more. I also briefly mentioned that there's too much focus on police safety. Some researchers say that when we consistently speak about police safety in an overemphasized way, or where we skew the statistics in such a way that makes it seem like officers are in danger all the time, that really changes the culture, and it leads to people being very quick to shoot and to constantly think that they're in danger of death or serious bodily injury. So I think that's really important. And then, obviously an impediment is that we don't often address institutional racism. There's a police view that black suspects are more dangerous, and they're more frequently stopped without reasonable suspicion, articulable reasonable suspicion, and then black communities are harassed. Well, what happens when you're black and you're being constantly harassed by police? You're pretty nervous when you get pulled over by a police officer. And so that racial stereotype becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The police departments need to acknowledge that. Again, they need to acknowledge that, they need to own that, and they need to say that changes are going to be made, and they need to hold people responsible when they're not making those changes. It's really interesting. Michael, when we do a motion to suppress in criminal court, and we show that an officer completely violated someone's privacy rights, that they searched without reasonable suspicion or probable cause, they invaded someone's home, their car, or their place where they're supposed to have privacy. No police officers are held accountable. You don't get a little ticker on, or
Great point.
Any sort of, I don't know, really any acknowledgement from your boss at all that you illegally searched someone. They suppress the evidence, and they think that that is good enough. The clauses in the law that say that you're not supposed to do that, and I can suppress that evidence if you obtained it illegally, they're really supposed to be deterring police officers from violating someone's privacy rights in the first place. But no one says a darn thing. That officer will still go home, won't care at all that gun or whatever got suppressed, beat themselves up on it only on their way to their car, and that's the last that you hear about them having violated someone's constitutional rights.
And Marnie, I'm so glad you broke it down that way, because, cops who do violate people's privacy rights and engage in illegal search, what they're actually doing is they're allowing more criminality to take place. Because if this person is a bad person, if this bad person has a gun, and this person is doing something illegal to the point where there is legitimate reasonable suspicion, there is legitimate probable cause, you want good police work to get the gun off the street. But sloppy police work keeps the guns on the street, so encourages criminality. So it seems to me that the law and order type should really go off on bad cops violating people's privacy rights.
The law and order types want to go after a judge that suppressed a gun, want to go after a DA who was in charge of that case, but they don't want to go after the officers who were the ones that did an illegal search, violated someone's constitutional rights that everyone deserves. That's who they don't go after. Instead, they're going to yell about this prosecutor and this judge. And those are people who, look, we should hold judges accountable. That's a whole different scenario that I think we need to have a talk about another day. We should hold our prosecutors responsible for the things they're actually responsible for. But things like that, they are not. We really need to look at the officers, and they need to be held accountable for this and shooting black people.
And Marnie, in our final 60 seconds, 90 seconds, if you, I'm going to pose the same question to you that I posed to Kevin. If you were the mayor, the police commissioner, or whatever, what are your proposed solutions in terms of what's realistic, what's pragmatic, what's practical? What would you do to try to address these reform issues? And after you give us that, how can folks contact you, whether it's phone number, email, social media, website? The microphone is yours for our final 90 seconds.
Thank you. I think that we need to push for everything. We need to kind of reach for the stars, and I think that we need to constantly push all of these reforms. But when we talk about what's practical, there are a lot of impediments. I think what we need to do is instead think about three things that I really think are important. We need to think about oversight, data collection, and transparency. And if we take those as our overarching goals and we continue to push for things under those umbrellas, then I think that we'll really be able to move reform. So I don't ever want to limit reform to what's practical. I want to push and push as hard as we can. But I think oversight, data collection, and transparency are things that we should all have on our minds when we're deciding what we want to ask for. And I want to say, too, I'm not speaking on behalf of our clients when I say these things. They will have their day. There are hundreds of people that we represent in this lawsuit, and they have amazing, diverse ideas. But I think we need to think about de-escalation and non-lethal tactics, increasing diversity in the police department, improving data collection and transparency, screening of police recruits, really racial recognition. We need to take accountability for the racist things that the police department does, and we need to end racial profiling stuff. So I think those are my things, and I think those are things that stakeholders in Philadelphia generally want to see. Again, I don't want to speak on behalf of our clients. They have so many ideas. I can't limit it to the summation. If you want to get in touch with me, my website is www.snyderlawyer.com. I can be reached at 215-515-3360. And my email's on my website, but it's marnie@snyderlawyer.com.
When I said to Kevin I was impressed with him, I will say the very same thing to you. I love the way you both take these convoluted, technical, esoteric issues and make them easily digestible to the average person. Marnie, I want to thank you not only for you explaining things so well today, but the great work you do as one of those social engineers that Charles Hamilton Houston talked about. Marnie, thank you very much.
Michael, thank you for everything you do also, and thank you for having me.
I appreciate that and appreciate you. Folks, we got to take a quick commercial break. When we get back, we're not done yet. We got to talk to Paul Hetznecker. We got to talk to Riley Ross. Last week, we already spoke to Stephen Stewart. First to break, WURD 96.1 FM.
WURD Radio presents the following wellness tip to support our listeners with mindfulness and motivation as we continue to navigate the pandemic together.
Hi, this is Halana, your resident health and wellness coach with tips to help you stay well. We breathe every day and have been doing so since before we were born. But wait, let's think about this for a moment. Something as simple as breathing can enhance our health and well-being. When we breathe mindfully, we slow down, take deep breaths, and activate our parasympathetic system to relax our bodies. Mindful breathing goes like this. Number 1, find a comfortable place to sit still for a few minutes. Number 2, close your eyes and relax your hands on your thighs. Number 3, take a deep breath in and count to 3. Then exhale your breath and count to 3. Do this 5 times. We sometimes think mindful breathing has to be an intense experience, yet even just a few minutes a day can make a big difference. Go ahead and try it today. Stay well with WURD. Happy living.
Stay well with WURD. Connect with us at wordradio.com. Livelihood, the new initiative from WURD Radio, connecting Philadelphians to jobs, entrepreneurship opportunities, small business resources, and financial literacy. Visit WURDworks.com right now and take the next step in your professional journey. Livelihood is supported by the Nightland Fest's Local News Transformation Fund, Borealis Philanthropies Racial Equity and Journalism Fund, and the Solutions Journalism Network. Lifting every voice till earth and heaven ring. This is WURD Radio, 96.1 FM and 900 AM WURD Philadelphia. Black Talk Media.
And while the revolution will not be televised, it is on the radio.
I believe in unions because if you look at the history of this country, things we take for granted, 40-hour work week, minimum wage, overtime, health care benefits.
This is not for the naive, the faint of heart, or the timid.
And Johnny Cochran was absolutely correct when he said that this is not for the naive, not for the faint of heart, and not for the timid. And he obviously was talking about WURD, not only our listeners, but our guests, because you heard Kevin Mincy say some strong stuff about police reform, fearlessly said those things. You heard Marnie Jo Snyder say some strong stuff about police reform and said it fearlessly. So I got to tell you, every time I think about these attorneys, I'm so glad that they understand what the law is about. And I got to be quite candid. We're talking about male lawyers. We're talking about female lawyers. We're talking about black lawyers. We're talking about white lawyers. And they've all come together to do the right thing. It's so amazing. I'm beginning to like lawyers more and more each day, thanks to Kevin Mincy, and thanks to Marnie Jo Snyder, and thanks to Paul Hetznecker and Riley Ross and Stephen Stewart. And speaking of Paul Hetznecker, if you listen to WRD, you've heard this gentleman on my show and other shows, because anytime you talk about civil rights litigation, anytime you talk about movement lawyering, you're talking about Paul Hetznecker. Without further ado, my good friend and yours, Paul Hetznecker. Paul, how are you today?
Good morning, Michael. Happy New Year. How are you?
Very same to you. And Paul, you did a great job last week. And last week, you spent about a minute or two talking about your bio. And I want you to do that again because, as I said to Marnie, as I said to Kevin, I want the listening audience to know that my guests know what they're talking about. And I want them to brag about what they've done to get them where they are. So, Paul, before we get into police reform, before we get into excessive force, before we get into First Amendment protections, talk a little bit about yourself. The microphone is yours, Paul.
Thank you, Michael. I've been practicing as a criminal defense and civil rights attorney for 34 years here in Philadelphia. Prior to that, I was a law student and activist, both in law school as well as an undergraduate, and even before that in high school. So my activist experience really informed my decisions about what to do with my career in law. And as you said, Michael, you know, the notion of a social engineer was something that I grabbed very early on in my career as a law student, and believed that, you know, you can represent corporations, you can represent large institutions, or you can represent people. And so I made the decision early on to represent people and vindicate their rights.
And you have done it very well. Before we get into today's topic, talk a little bit about some of the folks you've represented that the WRD listening audience might be aware of.
Well, it's a good question. I've represented a number of, or I should say hundreds of protesters over the years, groups of protesters. I was one of the key lawyers in organizing the representation of the RNC 2000, 420 people arrested back during the Republican National Convention. I also assisted with other lawyers during Occupy, as Marnie mentioned. Marnie and you, Michael, and I and several other lawyers represented many of the Occupy protesters. And then again in 2016 during the Democratic National Convention, I had the honor again of being a part of a group of lawyers representing those who were charged federally, and also those who were charged with civil citations. And throughout my career, aside from those major events, I've represented protesters, environmental activists, anti-war activists, animal rights activists. It goes on and on. In my belief that it's important to protect First Amendment rights in order to ensure a vibrant democracy.
Excellently stated. And Paul, we want you to talk now about your reaction to the report. It's captioned Philadelphia Police Department's response to demonstrations and civil unrest from May 30 to June 15. It was released back on December 23. It's about 110 pages long. Talk a little bit about two issues primarily. Anything you want, but I really want to hear about two issues. One, excessive force, and two, First Amendment protest. And what I want to do here, Paul, before you get started, I want to play the devil's advocate and sure, ask you, hey, when you talk about excessive force and First Amendment, what about the troublemakers? What about the looters? What about the rioters? Go ahead, Paul.
Well, you can't talk about the protest activity in this report without talking about the history of police violence against communities, especially communities of color in Philadelphia, going way back historically. As you know, Michael, and you've made note in the past, it was the 1968 Commission on Civil Rights, as well as the Human Rights Watch later on, the Seisler Report, subsequent reports that focused on the history of police violence, police brutality, use of excessive force in our communities. And that history, that legacy, cannot be discarded when we're talking about this, what I believe to be another, attempt to whitewash or cover up what really happened there during the 2 weeks of social unrest and political upheaval in June. I think it's a complete...
And Paul, before you go on, I really love the fact that you called it social unrest and political upheaval, because that frames the issue much better, because people normally, the term I used as the devil's advocate, talked about troublemakers and looters and rioters. So I'm so glad you're reframing the issue. Please continue, Paul.
Well, as Kevin and Marty both did an excellent job of reviewing, what we have is the interrelationship of the issues, and Kevin and Marty, and then Riley will as well, as Stephan did last week. My reaction is an outrage, as Stephan outlined last week. The notions of accountability and transparency, as Marty talked about just a few moments ago, are critical to understanding the narrative. So we have a narrative historically by the police from a one-sided point of view that justifies excessive force, justifies overreaction, justifies police power, intruding on the civil liberties and the liberty interests of people in our city. And that narrative has been altered, as Kevin talked about, with body-worn cameras. It's been altered by the use of cell phone video. We have an awakening in this country from all of the police-involved shootings that have been on videotape over the last half-decade or so. We have an understanding now that has motivated people to action. And the understanding is that third eye, the eye of truth, of accuracy, the eye that sees through the narrative that the police have been putting out historically, now pulls away all the layers of falsehoods about the relationship between the excessive use of force, the power of the police to undermine civil liberties in this country. And so that the historical roots of that, of the war on crime and the war on drugs, the war on civil liberties, has now culminated after 50 years in a revelation through the use of modern technology that, in fact, this war has been a war on civil liberties that has been unending, and that the corresponding reaction must be seizing back our democracy, seizing back the interests that we all have in maintaining accountability and transparency, as Marty talks about, and as we look forward into the future with reforms. But this particular document prepared by the police is an excuse for their bad actions.
Explain that, because as I said, it's about 110 pages long. The average person is not going to read it. I believe there are about 77 recommendations. You called it a whitewashing. Explain that. Why do you use those terms?
Well, I think it goes to the heart of what was mentioned before, and what I've been talking about for a long, long time, and it is the culture within the police department. It is a culture. The police department is essentially untethered by political accountability. Yes, the mayor can fire and hire the police commissioner, but in terms of the use of force, in terms of accountability to a democratic structure, the use of force, the use of deadly force, has basically gone unpunished and undisciplined for decades. And so we have recommendations here. They talk about the proper use of the baton. In fact, of 37 of 46 reported incidents of use of force. Now, that's reported. Now, you and I know, Michael, as our team knows, that there were many more. There were hundreds of uses of force, and yet we don't have those documents. What this report refers to is 46, and 37 of those are use of the baton. Now, this is illustrative, and I'll tell you why. If you're talking about the use of a baton on someone's head, as was demonstrated by Inspector Bologna on the head of a Temple student, which was on video, that criminal act is essentially a use of deadly force. And so the way in which this report approaches this is, well, maybe we need to recategorize the use of the baton as deadly force, and then goes on to describe how we need better training in use of the baton. No, the baton is a weapon. You take that baton out at a peaceful protest, and you've indicated to those peaceful protesters as a police officer that you're going to use it. that what you see their activity as being illegitimate up against police power and police authority. And that's at the root of this. It's essentially a justification. This report is a justification of police authority and police abuse. So that's an example. So 37 out of 46 reported involved the baton. And then they go on to say in the same report that the baton is more effective for crowd control than the asp. The asp is the long metal, collapsible metal rod that's used by many police officers. Now, how does that justify, or how do they explain that expression of police tactic as a justified use of force, as a more effective justified use of force, match up against their reported 37 of the 46 baton use of force memos indicating the use of baton? So is it excessive force? Is it more effective? Is it both? Is it another example of police power and the extension of police power that's consistent with the culture of abuse that is the legacy of this Philadelphia Police Department?
Wow. Wow. I love the way you broke that down, Paul. We don't have a whole lot of time, but we still got enough time to go into any specific issues you want to talk about. And as I said to the listening audience, we wanted you to talk about, relative to the report, excessive force and First Amendment protections. You talked a bit about excessive force. We'll come back to that. But let's now talk about First Amendment protection. What does that mean? Does that mean you have the right to take a sign and go in the street and block traffic? Does that mean you can walk up to a police officer and yell and scream in his face? What does that mean when you talk about First Amendment protections and protests?
That's a great question, and I think people have, much the way there's been descriptions of blurring the lines between police authority and what's lawful. We know that under our democracy and under the First Amendment that expressions of uncomfortable speech, of disruptive language, of
I love that term, uncomfortable speech. Okay,
exactly that uncomfortable, disruptive, and also oftentimes offensive language, depending upon your position, that's at the root of our democracy. That's exactly what people have fought and died for, is the ability to express a dissenting point of view in a manner which is nonviolent, but a manner which may be confrontational. And so part of the root of the problem is that police have unfettered authority on the street to determine when they believe an individual has stepped outside the bounds of what might be the First Amendment, and they're not.
So the cop on the street becomes the judge, jury, and executioner.
Precisely, and that in the cases that you and I have tried, Michael, involving First Amendment protections, that's exactly where we've won those cases. Is educating the jury or the judge that, in fact, if you can disrupt the street to build a sewer line, if you can disrupt the street to build a corporate tower and streets get blocked because of construction, you can disrupt a street and some traffic for a period of time to protect the core rights under our democracy. And I think once that's understood by those in authority and power, that the expression of First Amendment rights, it's going to be disruptive. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to interfere with traffic. But during Occupy, we had 43 days of occupation of that Occupy movement, and every single day there were marches and multiple marches. And Civil Affairs actually, to their credit, did a great job of protecting and ensuring those First Amendment rights. So it's not like we don't have a history of some positive examples of police involvement through Civil Affairs with protesters. We have. The dark side of that, the dangerous part of that, is the invisible hand of surveillance. It's the use of surveillance by the Fusion Center. It's use of surveillance by the police department in conjunction with other agencies like the FBI or the state police to investigate and undermine First Amendment rights, because it's all predicated, unfortunately, on the following: the belief that somehow progressive protest movements are breeding grounds for terrorism or breeding grounds for threats to national security. And that lie and that myth has been perpetuated all throughout the decades. So, for example, when they talk about better training in the report regarding how to discern between First Amendment rights and criminal activity, they need to look no further than themselves, because the police have been accumulating information, false information, about protest movements for decades, and it's been perpetuated by a culture within law enforcement that says if you step out on the street and protest against corporate America, or you step out on the street and you protest against police brutality, then somehow you become the subject and the target of mass surveillance.
And Paul, just so I'm clear, are you talking about surveillance by the local police, or are you talking about federal authorities?
Both. It's coordinated.
Wow.
In fact, they refer to the coordination of that. So one of the recommendations is not less surveillance to protect First Amendment rights. One of the recommendations in the CNA report is broader surveillance, greater surveillance, social media sites, open source information. And that's the danger, and that's an underlying, very insidious and invisible threat to our democracy.
You mean I could go out and engage in peaceful protests and find my name on the federal list tomorrow?
Well, I've got a long story that I can provide you one day with precisely that, where I represented a journalist, an online journalist, who was arrested and charged. And because of that false arrest, simply because she was at a protest, an anti-war protest back in 2009 or 2010, she ended up on a watch list. And that should not discourage people from protesting, just the opposite. It should encourage people and empower them to say that the rights that we seek in our democracy we must vindicate, not only on the streets, not only in the halls of our legislatures and courtrooms, but we need to do so within the culture of law enforcement as well. And that requires an inversion of the power dynamic. And that means, as has been mentioned before, accountability. So City Council has within their purview right now the opportunity with a powerful referendum to develop a police accountability system, a board, a civilian review board that has subpoena power, that can look at individual cases of misconduct, but also broader swaths of patterns and practices within the culture of the police department, to make those changes so that undemocratic paramilitary organization has some level of accountability and now has some level of transparency, or a greater level of transparency, and is now answerable to the general public in our democracy. And I know that Riley's going to talk a little bit about the militarization of the police, and I want to make mention of this as we segue into Riley. It's really important. He'll do an excellent, thorough job on this. But as a segue to it, one of the problems we've had, and it's reflected in this report, is that we have a military-based, occupation-based mentality in law enforcement regarding crime, regarding protests, regarding the interaction between the police and the public. As Marnie said, every interaction with the police, from the police perspective, is a dangerous one. Every car stop, every stop. So that level of mentality heightens the confrontation, and the likelihood doesn't de-escalate. What we need is we need to go back. We need to go back to the community-based policing models that existed 20, 30, 40 years ago, but have been ignored. We need to go back to the de-escalation models that have been looked at and reviewed, but again ignored over decades. We need to reimagine the culture of the Philadelphia Police Department, as you, Michael, say, not just the notion of defund, it's really defang, as you say. And I attribute that great term to you because that's precisely right. We defang the police. We empower the police to do what they should be doing, which is community engagement and community outreach and community-based policing.
Wow. We have on the line my good friend and yours. To many of WRD listening audience, you hear him quite frequently on legal issues at this radio station, none other than Paul Hetznecker. If you talk about the Dean of Movement Lawyers in Philly, you're talking about Paul. Paul, as we wrap things up in your closing argument, your summation, one, I'd like you to provide us with some contact information, a phone number, email, whatever, and talk about some proposed solutions. You pretty much did that in a sense by talking about the Civilian Review Board, de-escalation models from the past, defanging. But I know in regard to the report that we're talking about, there were 77 recommendations. And by the way, people should know that these are mere recommendations to be vetted by the city, so none of that is etched in stone. So, Paul, if there were, say, 2 or 3 key things you do if you were the mayor or the police commissioner or city council, what would those top concerns be in addition to or apart from what you already proposed? And after you give us some of those solutions, please provide us with contact information.
I will, Michael. Thank you very much. First, I will say, in addition to what I said about the strength and the teeth of a vital police review board, it's important not to let the bad apples and the culture of bad apples drive the police department. It needs to be. We need to overturn the apple cart. We need to now allow for outside review on a regular basis of the police department's activities and behavior. Much of the recommendations here in this report defer back to the old model, defer back to the police commissioner, defer back to policing agencies that have reviewed police and reinforced police behavior for decades. What we need to do is a reevaluation of the institution from top to bottom. And that includes, the systematic racism, obviously, as a part of policing, not only in Philadelphia, but nationwide. So my recommendation would be that whatever the city council is able to put together, that the broad-reaching powers of this police citizens board, review board, must look at both specific but also broad patterns of behavior within the police department and have the power to change them. Be given the authority to go in and change what needs to be changed from the ground up, and have accountability and transparency all the way through the department on every level, from its disciplinary process to its training process, to its enforcement of policies, to its exposition of particular investigations. All of that must be on the board and in full view of the public, because the nature of democracy is putting light on those dark places within the annals of power that we don't have access to, and that's what needs to happen with the Philadelphia Police Department.
Powerful, powerful, powerful stuff. Paul, as we wrap this up, how can folks reach you? Phone, email, social media, website? What's the best way?
Thank you, Michael. You can reach me through my email address at phetznecker, my last name, HETZNECKER, at AOL.com, and my phone number is 215-893-9640. And once again, Michael, I'm honored to be on your show, and I'm also proud to be a part of this wonderful team that we have in seeking to vindicate the rights of those 237 plaintiffs that we represent.
And just so you all know what Paul is talking about, we touched on it earlier in the show. We're part of a group of attorneys who are doing what we need to do regarding seeking compensatory damages, if appropriate, punitive damages, and we're clearly highlighting the issue of reform. And again, no disrespect to any other attorneys. There are many out there doing the right thing, but I love this group that includes Kevin Mincy and Marnie Jo Snyder and Paul Hetznecker, and coming up Riley Ross and Stephen Stewart. I mean, these are attorneys who do the right thing, fight for their clients' financial interests, but also wants to make changes in societies. That's why I call them what Charles Hamilton Houston called them, social engineers. Paul, thank you very much for your time, but more important, thank you for your great work.
Thank you for your work, Michael, and again, it's an honor to be on your show. Thank you.
All right. And folks, as I told you, when we started off with Kevin, we were 1 for 1. He did his thing. Then we had Marnie Jo Snyder, 2 for 2. She did her thing. And then you just heard Paul Hetznecker, 3 for 3. And I guess we can add Stephen Stewart, who, in fact, not guess, I know we can add Stephen Stewart, who was on last week. That brought us 4 for 4, and we're going to wrap things up today with a gentleman who you heard from last week, Riley Ross. And Riley is going to talk a little bit about his background, and I had been working with Riley for several months before I found out that he had been a victim of police brutality. You know, I always respected his passion for reforming the system. I just thought he was a good guy and a great lawyer. But he had a personal story to tell as to why he's such a great lawyer, fighting for the rights of those who have been abused. Without further ado, well, let's do this. Instead of interrupting what I know is going to be a great interview with Riley Ross, let's take our commercial break now. And when we come back, you're going to hear from attorney Riley Ross. But first, a break. WURD 96.1 FM.
This message is from the Philadelphia Department of Public Health. COVID-19 is still a threat in our communities, but we can all do something simple to help stop the spread. It's critically important to wear a mask or face covering whenever you're in public or around others. Yes, even while social distancing. Wearing a mask shows you care for yourself and your community and is essential to slowing the spread of COVID-19. So love yourself, love your neighbors, wear a mask.
You're listening to WURD Radio, 96.1 FM and 900 AM WURD, independent black media. You're listening to the Radio Courtroom with attorney Michael Cord, exclusively on WURD Radio, 96.1 FM and 900 AM WURD, Black Talk Media.
Yep, this is Black Talk Media, WRD 96.1 FM, WRD 900 AM, WRD Radio, and also catch us streaming, WRD Facebook Live, catch us streaming, WURD YouTube, catch us streaming, WURD Twitch. As I pointed out earlier, there's a team of attorneys, a team of social engineers who are fighting not only for the rights of about nearly 250, the exact number is 237 folks who have been, from those folks' perspective, brutalized and assaulted by the police, whether with tear gas or pepper spray or rubber bullets or anything that could cause injury, serious injury. And before the commercial break, I mentioned that we're going to wrap things up with attorney Riley Ross. So without further ado, Riley, how are you today?
Hey, Michael, I'm good. Happy New Year.
Not only are you good, Riley, you're great. And as you were last week and as you certainly will be this week, Riley, let's start off with you as we did with the other attorneys. Spend about a minute or so filling in the listening audience regarding your background, because once again, when I have experts like you all on, I want the listening audience to know that these folks know what they're talking about. You certainly know what you're talking about. So let's start off, Riley, with another introduction about yourself, and then we'll get into a phrase you often use, quote, warrior policing, unquote. Then we're going to tie that into transparency of complaints. But first, your bio, and then what do you mean by warrior policing? Go ahead, Riley. The microphone is yours.
Thanks, Michael. I am a criminal defense and civil rights attorney. I'm a partner with Mincy Fitzpatrick Ross. You heard from my partner Kevin Mincy earlier. I've been practicing for over 20 years now, which is hard to believe. I started off as after graduating from the University of Virginia in 1999, I clerked for a federal judge for a year in Virginia, and then I spent about 3.5 years at a firm in Washington, D.C. I left there to join the Federal Public Defender's Office down in Norfolk, Virginia. I'm from Virginia, and really enjoyed my time down there. It was tough, though. At the time, the federal sentencing guidelines were mandatory, so you had a lot of people who looked like me, young black men that were going to jail for 10, 20 years, and it was very hard to represent them. A lot of cases could not go to trial. We had, about 98% of the cases were ended in guilty plea because the stakes were so high with those federal cases.
And Riley, before you go on, I'm so glad that you said that, because I actually stopped doing a lot of federal criminal defense work because I had to plead my client out. And I just didn't feel like I was doing anything to make any real changes. Although pleading my client out was the best thing to do strategically, I just didn't feel good about that. Please continue.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my practice down there was the trial work was really in the sentencing. We put on full trials of the sentencing to try to get as close as we could to a just outcome. You know, a lot of people don't understand that any drug case, wherever you do it, is a federal offense. It's just whether or not the feds decide to take it federally. Any gun offense is a federal offense. It just depends on whether or not the feds decide to take it federally. So a lot of these drug and gun cases start off as state cases, but then the feds come and take them federal. And a lot of times they take them federal because the consequences are much greater, and that puts leverage on the defendant then to plead guilty and or cooperate. So where he or she may be looking at a drug possession with intent to distribute charge in state court, it may be looking at anything from probation to 2 or 3 years. You take it federal, and you're looking at a mandatory 5 or mandatory 10 years. And when the feds decide which cases they're going to take federal, you don't think that they're not going to take the ones that are hard to win. They're going to
Yes.
cherry pick and take the
Yes.
ones where you already have it on camera, or maybe there's already a confession, or maybe there's a buy to an undercover agent. And so the ones that you see come in federal court they result in guilty pleas because they are, you can't take them to trial because the facts are stacked against the defendant, and the consequences are too great. So,
Riley,
yeah,
I'm
you
so
have a lot
glad
of
you
cases
said that
end
because
that
I
way.
felt like the feds were picking on me. Like, why do they only come after my client if there's audio tape and videotape and a CI and all that stuff? But you're right. They select the ones they want, and the ones they want are the ones with audio and video and CIs and all that. So you'd be foolish to take a case like that to trial. I'm so glad you broke that down. Riley, please continue. By the way, those who are tuning in, you're listening to Riley Ross. He's giving us some brief info about his background, and then he's going to jump into the issue of police reform. Please continue, Riley.
So I was at the Federal Defender's Office for about 3 years and moved to Philadelphia. My beautiful wife is a law professor at Villanova, and she took a job with Villanova, and that brought us to Philly. And when I got here, I worked for a small firm under Greg Miller, Miller Alfano Responti, and then that firm merged with a bigger firm, Drinker Biddle. I was there for about a year. Loved getting back to a smaller firm where I went to work with your friend Joe Tucker, the Tucker Law Group, for a few years. Really learned a lot more on the civil side there, and went out on my own. Had my own practice for about 5 years before I joined forces with my partners, Kevin Mincy and Tom Fitzpatrick. And we've been doing great things for about the last 2.5 years now. And it's been. In
fact, Riley, if you could just give a shout out to the folks at that firm, because I love the firm, the great work they do. I know everybody there, but just go through the list of attorneys at that firm.
So we have Kevin Mincy, Tom Fitzpatrick, both former prosecutors. We have Shabri Parker, who is another partner at the firm, and she does family law and trust and estates. We have Sean Page, who is a criminal defense attorney who does great work all over the state. We have Zainab Ali, who is an associate with our firm. She does a lot of criminal and civil work. And then we have our council member, Ike Green, who does a lot of employment work and really just keeps us, he's like our historical bank at the firm. Just, you can call a case out. You think about something, he says, take a look at this case from, 1972, and he's right on point. So we have a
and I wanted to do that because there's some great folks at that firm, and folks need to know about it. Let's jump right into it now, Riley. What do you mean by the phrase you often use, warrior policing? What is that?
So warrior policing is really a mindset and a way of training police officers to develop and basically approach their job with this warrior mentality. And this is not a hyperbole. This is not something that I'm making up. This is actual training. There's a gentleman by the name of Dave Grossman who I think the Republic did an article on several years ago. They followed him around when he was doing training. He's a former Army Ranger, and he was doing training to police officers, a lot of them in Pennsylvania at the time. And he was essentially teaching them that you've got to have this warrior mindset, where you treat the community, your job as if you are a soldier at war, and you treat the communities that you serve as if they were territories that were occupied by potential insurgents. And the training that goes with this is basically teaching you have to be prepared to kill at any moment. You have to look at every person in that community as a threat. And you have to create this us versus them mentality that Marnie Joe talked about earlier. It's a real thing, and that is the guiding of the training that goes on, and that's where that's why you hear a lot of phrases like, we have to make sure the officers go home to their family at night. We have to make sure the officers are protected. The officers fear for their safety. It's to basically support this mindset that acting aggressively, acting violently is the way to go, because they're in a violent situation, and that violent situation calls for violent reactions and violent protections. And in
fact, Riley, what I'd like you to, at this point, talk about, and I'm only mentioning it because you brought it up on the radio, and I think it's a powerful story, especially, and it's a great segue into this phrase you use, again, warrior policing. Talk about what happened to you as a victim of police brutality.
Yeah. So when I
this whole warrior mentality, please.
Yeah. When I was home from college, I was about 19 years old. I grew up in Virginia Beach, and down in Virginia Beach at the waterfront, the police were very aggressive. They still are down there. A lot of racial issues growing up, but just overall, regardless of races, the police were extremely aggressive in how they treated people down at the oceanfront. And the bars back then, even though I was under 21, you could go into bars. They put a wristband on people who could drink, and so we go into bars, and when the bars emptied out at the end of the night, the sidewalks had regular pavement, but then they would have a strip of bricks going down the middle. And basically, when you came out of the bars, if there was anything going on, because there was often crowds or traffic was backed up on the oceanfront because people would do what they call cruising the strip. And if you coming out of the bars, the police, in order to kind of regulate you, they would say you can't step over the bricks. If you step over the bricks, you're going to jail. And that way they kind of keep the flow of traffic close to the buildings and not closer to the street. And one night I was down there, and a friend of mine I was in the bar. A friend of mine came in, really upset. He'd just gotten jumped by a couple of guys, and he wanted to go find them. So we go out with him, and he's really excited. And because he's kind of going crazy, he draws police's attention, and he almost gets himself arrested. I stepped in, kind of calmed the situation, actually talked to the officer, told him, we'll take care of him. We'll make sure that nothing happens, and we were able to defuse that situation. We go back to the bar. Bar's closed later that night. I'm talking to my friends. I come to lose track of my buddy, come back out. There's a big commotion in the middle of the strip, and I see my friend who's on the ground with the same police officer basically putting him in cuffs. Everybody, of course, is watching. Apparently, a fight broke out. I think he found the guys who had tried to jump him, or at least one of them. And the police officer who's holding him down, we're all watching. He looks over and he starts motioning to me, come here. And I even turn around and look at people beside me, like, you talking to me? And he says, yes. And I'm thinking maybe he wants me to try to help calm my guy, calm my buddy down again. I take a step to walk towards him in the middle of the street. The next thing I know, I feel a blow to my chest. I see my feet up in the air, and I come crashing down on the curb and land on my back on the curb. And because I stepped over those bricks, another police officer who I didn't even see to my right, decided that I needed to be hit in the chest with his baton, and that's what he did. And I was in excruciating, wind knocked out of me, couldn't breathe, in a lot of pain. Still have back problems to this day from that. I went down to Internal Affairs, tried to file a report, and nothing came of it. And I decided right then and there that I was going to be a lawyer, and I was going to never let something like that happen to me again. And I didn't want it to happen to other people. And that was the kind of the fuel for my work in criminal defense and civil rights.
Well, when you first told that story here at WRD, I said, I'm not glad that anybody was brutalized by that, but I am glad that that thing happened in a way that the cop who hit you in the chest, he actually created a monster, because then you went out, I'm talking about a constructive monster, a monster who's going around looking for justice and looking for equality and fairness, and that's exactly what you do as a litigator. So it's unfortunate that it happened, but there's something good that came out of it, and that good is you, Riley Ross, attorney extraordinaire. Riley, we got to take a quick commercial break. When we come back, we're going to talk more specifically about this whole warrior policing as a problem, but also a solution. We want you to tie into that the whole notion of transparency of complaints. You talked about how you, as a college student, tried to file a complaint and nothing came out of it. We're going to talk about all that. First, a break. WURD 96.1 FM.
This is not a fad for us. We will not resume our regular programming when things die down. We're not black to help our bottom line or because it's politically correct. We're not joining a fight. This has been our fight, our message, our people. Black lives have always mattered here. We are undeniably, indefatigably, unapologetically, permanently Black Talk Media. WURD. The Word Radio newsletter, keeping you informed, engaged, and connected. Sign up by visiting wordradio.com. Scroll to the bottom of the page and type your email address under Connect with Us. You'll receive the latest information on Word Radio, messages from our president and CEO, Sarah Lomax Reese, exclusive articles and multimedia content, and resources. Stay informed with the Word Radio newsletter.
This is the radio courtroom. We got to deal with the law first and foremost.
I'm not guilty. You're the one who's guilty. Lawmakers, the politicians, the Colombian drug lords, all you who lobby against making drugs legal, just like you did with alcohol during the Prohibition. I mean, not one of us in here owns a poppy field. This is big business. This is the American way.
And this right here is even bigger business. It's the African American way. And I got to tell you, this has been a great show today. It is still a great show. We started off with Attorney Extraordinaire Kevin Mincy, Attorney Extraordinaire Marnie Joe Snyder, Attorney Extraordinaire Paul Hetznecker. Last week we had Attorney Extraordinaire Stephen Stewart. And right now, right here at this very moment, we have Attorney Extraordinaire Riley Ross. He's talking to us not only about his impressive bio, not only his tragic story of how he was brutalized as a college student by police, but he's also telling us more broadly about warrior policing and going to start to tell us about transparency in filing complaints. What does all that mean? How do you do it? What happens? So in our final 8 to 10 minutes, you're going to hear from Riley Ross. Riley, please continue. The microphone is yours for the remaining 8 to 10 minutes.
Thanks, Michael. So I wanted to just, in moving into transparency, talk about the problems with warrior policing and what it leads to. So when you go into encounters with this us versus them mentality, and you believe that every person I encounter is a threat, you couple that with our country's history of racism and the belief that black people and black men in particular are a threat, then there's no wonder that we have such violent encounters, and you have, scenarios where police are shooting black men at alarming at such higher rates. And the problem with that is that the training that the police are having doesn't match the actual work that the police are doing. When they're going out there, they're not going into neighborhoods that should be treated like occupied territories. They are actually not. Your average officer doesn't even spend most of his or her time responding to any type of violent calls. I talked about this last week. There was a study that's been done by Jerry Ratcliffe, who's a professor over at Temple University, he's a criminologist, and he broke down, what do police spend their time doing? And they don't spend their time doing activities that relate anyway to warrior policing type training. They spend time responding to unfounded calls, meaning someone places a call for police and they show up and no one's there. They spend time responding to false alarms, traffic accidents, disorderly conduct where crowds are gathered, medical assistance. Things that when people start talking about defunding the police, or as you coined and Paul mentioned, defanging the police, moving resources from the police and putting them to other activities where other professions are better apt to handle them, such as mental health calls and the like. So they're not even doing jobs that call for that type of training. Now, when you have these violent encounters and people go and make complaints, just like I did when I was a college student, they need to be investigated, and they need to be the results need to be broadcast, and the public needs to know about it. But that's not what we have happening here. You have, when you make a complaint, the complaint goes to internal affairs for the police, and what that amounts to then is the police are policing themselves. Now, I can't stand here and tell you that every single internal affairs complaint is bogus or doesn't amount to anything. I don't know. I'm not saying that, but I can tell you that the ones that I've been involved with don't really amount to much. And what happens more times than not is that any client that I've taken in to make a complaint, or any client that I've had that I've investigated complaints they made to internal affairs, they're treated more like victims, or they're treated more like criminals than they are victims.
Great point.
When they go and meet with, first of all, here's what happens when you file a complaint with Internal Affairs. Like Rakia Young, who Kevin Mincy talked about earlier, the woman who was pulled out of her car after making a wrong turn. What she has happened is that after this violent encounter where the police swarm her car, smash all her windows, and pull her out of a car, separate her from her baby, she then a few days later has a uniformed police officer come knocking on her door, wanting to talk to her, leaving a card. Apparently, we find out he's representing Internal Affairs. Internal Affairs aren't uniformed police officers that are conducting this. So they send uniformed police officers out to this person's house who was just terrorized by the police.
Yes.
And say, hey, we want you to come talk to us and tell us about the police officer's behavior. That's pretty intimidating. And that
no doubt
sounds like an intentional way of silencing someone rather than getting them to come and talk to you. And then when you have the Internal Affairs report occur, let's say that someone doesn't want to go, and after this intimidating encounter where some police officer comes knocking on her door, what Internal Affairs does, instead of going and investigating it themselves, they just say, okay, that's an unfounded report because this person didn't show up and give a statement. Instead of going out and talking to other people who may have witnessed this, if the person who was abused doesn't follow through, doesn't meet their requirements to do a report, it becomes unfounded, and now the officers involved have no blemishes on their records. This is not the way this should be done. It should be done with transparency. It should be done with an oversight. It shouldn't be the police policing themselves. We have a great opportunity, as Paul talked about, with this oversight commission that the people of Philadelphia voted for to now come in and be formed and have actual teeth. It's going to be created under city council instead of under the police. And so we have an opportunity to have a real oversight commission that can bring forth real transparency. Because here's the thing. People talk about, good police officers out there. Not all police officers are bad. I understand that. I don't have time to qualify myself by explaining that. We all know that there's good police officers. But the bad ones are not just the ones who do the actual police brutality, but the other officers that are around that don't call them out and don't report them, or file reports that correspond with that bad officer's police report that doesn't mention the brutality that he or she used in conducting that arrest or what have you. When police officers are given the authority to take a life, they're given the authority to take a person's liberty, to put you in handcuffs. When they're given that authority and given that power, there should be great responsibility that comes with that. And so when we talk about, you don't know what it's like to be a police officer, what about in their shoes? Yeah, you're right. I don't know what it's like to be that, but that's not my job, And if it were my job, and if I were given that greater power, then I would expect it that I can't be treated like any everyday Joe. I got to live up to a higher standard, and I got it because I've been given this greater power. So I see nothing wrong with holding police to a higher standard because they're given the authority and given the permission to take a person's life and to take a person's liberty and freedom.
Makes sense. Yes.
At any moment, and we should hold them to a higher standard.
That's some great stuff. I mean, and speaking of great stuff, you touched on quite a bit. You talked about transparency, this oversight commission. But before we wrap things up, Riley, let's say you were the mayor, you were the police commissioner, you were whatever in a position to do something concretely and specifically and immediately, apart from or in addition to what you've already mentioned as some possible solutions. What would you do?
Well, I'm really just going to underscore what I said. I would establish this oversight commission with some real teeth, meaning it would have subpoena powers, the ability to force people to come in and testify. It would have the ability to fire officers. I would make sure that their complaints against them were transparent, that the public knew about them, that any discipline that was rendered to the officers could not be overturned by the police union. I would take the police union out of the disciplinary process altogether, make the process fair. I'm all about due process. I want everyone to have their day in court and have a fair process. That's what I fight for every day. So I would want to make sure they go through a fair process that we can trust and take the police union out of it completely. I would want to move money out of the police force. When we talk about defanging the police and demilitarizing the police, we have put so much money into police forces for military vehicles, militaristic tactics. I would take that money out because, as I just showed, they are being trained for things that they're not even doing. move that money to other resources, to social services, to people who can help supplement these 911 calls by going out and responding to health crisis, by going out and responding to nuisance crisis, by regulating. We have police officers that are sitting there, blocking off traffic when someone needs to hang a new street light. Have other resources that do that, so you don't have police on every corner ready to respond with a warrior police mentality to any situation. And I would restructure the training so that the training is more in line with the work that they're actually doing. Those are some of the things that I would do, along with many other things that my colleagues are talking about. We are working as a team to put together a package and respond with the advice of our clients, who many of them are activists, to get real reform. We have an opportunity to do that here in Philadelphia, and we are taking that opportunity. We're taking it to the city. We are demanding reform. We have clients who, they're not talking about, they're talking about real reform here. And we have a very unique opportunity to do that. And we intend to take advantage of that opportunity.
Riley, I really appreciate those proposed solutions. They are pragmatic, they are practical, and they are doable. Before we wrap things up, Riley, I'll ask you what I asked the other folks, which is, what's your contact information? I know your partner is a Kevin Mincy, so it'll be the same thing, but I want folks to write it down as you say it. What's the phone number, the website? Is there anything on social media? How do folks contact you?
Well, I'll start off with the phone number. That'd be the easiest way to contact us. We have great staff that take care of us and make sure that we connect with our clients. It's at 215-587-0006. That's 215-587-0006. And if you want to check us out, you can go to our website. The law firm is Mincy Fitzpatrick Ross, and the website is mincyfitzross.com. That's MINCEY, F as in Frank, ITZROSS.com, mincyfitzross.com. And Michael, I just want to thank you for having our team on. Thank you for the work that you're doing. I'm learning from you every day, and I just really thank you for the opportunity to come on and speak to your audience.
I appreciate you saying that, Riley Ross. Thanks for the interview today, but more important, thanks for the great work you do. Riley Ross, thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael.
All right, and before we wrap things up, and we will within the next about 90 seconds, big shout out to the team of attorneys, team of social engineers. Remember that Charles Hamilton Houston, who was the dean of civil rights litigation, the mentor to the only, and I do mean the only, black member of the U.S. Supreme Court in history. Yeah, I did say only. I meant only Thurgood Marshall, because since then there has been no other black Supreme Court justice, and I mean that. Having said that, big shout out to the attorneys on today, because they are mentees of Charles Hamilton Houston, mentees of Thurgood Marshall, because as Charles Hamilton Houston said, that a lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite on society. As I pointed out, these attorneys, they fight for compensation for their clients. They fight to seek punitive damages where appropriate, but most important, they fight for reform, to make real changes. And that's why I'm so impressed with them. So big shout out to Stephen Stewart. We had him on last week. Big shout out to Kevin Mincy. Big shout out to Marnie Jo Snyder. Big shout out to Paul Hetznecker. Big shout out to Riley Ross. There will be changes made in terms of police misconduct, police brutality, and those attorneys, those are the persons you need to thank for that. They're representing, I'm part of the team, representing nearly 250 persons, exactly 237. And it's not just about them. It's about anybody that could be brutalized by any police officer. So again, big shout out and big thank you to Stephen Stewart, to Kevin Mincy, to Marnie Jo Snyder, to Paul Hetznecker, and to Riley Ross. By the way, folks, I write a weekly column in the Tribune, and I wrote it this week about Watch Night. You know, every December 31, every New Year's Eve, black folks, usually headed by black pastors at black churches, have something called Watch Night. No disrespect to those black pastors, but historically, they get it completely wrong. If you want to know what Watch Night is really about, and by the way, our ancestors called it Freedom's Eve. It had to do with their anticipated approach to, or their anticipation to, the Emancipation Proclamation by Abe Lincoln. We know that really wasn't worth the paper it was written on, but for our ancestors, it was hope for freedom. That's why they called it Freedom's Eve. They didn't call it Watch Night. It's not a religious thing. It's a historical thing. For more information, check out my article in the Philadelphia Tribune. Just go to phillytrib.com. That's phillytrib.com. Type in my name, Cord. Type in Watch Night. Type in Freedom's Eve, and you'll find out more. Again, thank you to the attorneys that did a great job. Those of you who couldn't get through today, we apologize. I'm going to end today's show like I end every show. It goes like this. Arrest and prosecute the cops who murdered Breonna Taylor.